It allows your starter to be happy and bubbly and fed. Oh God, that was so stupid. Hi! Today I wanted to record my entire process for making sourdough bread. I am obsessed with sourdough bread. I'm obsessed with eating it, and recently I've become obsessed with making it. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the process of making sourdough bread, it could take somewhere between 2 or 3 days just to make a loaf of bread. I wanted to make this video for those who enjoy eating it to gain this newfound appreciation for why it tastes so good. And for those of you who are interested in making your own sourdough bread, I hope it gives you an introduction for what you can come to expect once you start on this sourdough journey. The first thing that you may be wondering is, what's the difference between sourdough bread and other breads? The biggest difference is, how are these bread rising? Sourdough bread uses wild yeast in the form of a starter, whereas a lot of commercially available breads or breads that you may have baked before uses commercial yeast that you would get in a package. Bread that's made on a very large scale, a lot of those companies prefer using this commercial yeast because it's very convenient. It comes in this little packet, it rises a lot faster, and it's a lot more predictable. If a sourdough starter is so much more finicky than commercial yeast, why would I ever worry about keeping this alive when I could get guaranteed results with this? For me personally, I love the taste of sourdough bread. I love the complexity that a starter gives it, and I love that my bread, when I make it with sourdough starter, can stand on its own. I don't need butter because the texture and the taste is just so beautiful. What is a starter actually made of? It's made of wild yeast, flour, and water. It looks like goop, but it's actually alive. A sourdough starter is us being able to capture wild yeast in a form that we can use for baking. So if you're looking to create your own starter, you can just add 100 grams of water, 100 grams of flour, mix it together, and do that continuously for 5 days. Day 2, add 100 grams of water, 100 grams of flour, and soon you should see bubbling on the surface, and your starter should start doubling in volume and creating a very sour smell. And what this means is that the yeast in there is starting to feed off of the sugars in the flour and is starting to create carbon dioxide and create this very acidic environment. Now I'm going to go through the process of feeding my starter. Your starter needs to be fed about once a week. First step, most important thing, is to get a scale. I know for Americans, we never use scales when cooking, but in the case of baking, it's very, very important because we can't just go off of volume. A starter is going to increase and decrease in volume once it gets more or less air, and it's just too unpredictable if we were to use volume to measure versus weight. I'm going to mix in 50 grams of water. Stir the mixture around. This way the starter gets all over the water, and all the water has wild yeast within it. Now I'm going to add 50 grams of flour. I choose to use whole wheat flour. I like the taste of whole wheat flour the best, but a lot of people like to start with all-purpose because it is more predictable in some ways. Now that the flour and water is at a 1-to-1 ratio, I'm just going to mix it around as well. Okay, now my flour and water are equally mixed. I'm just going to put a little piece of tape, write down when I fed it, and then mark off where in the jar the sourdough starter is, because it should start to rise within a few hours. So I want to just see how much it's risen. All right, now 3 hours has passed since the feeding. You can see there's one giant bubble, but it hasn't risen as much as I would like. In fact, it's barely risen. There's a few bubbles you can start seeing here, but it's just not as active after 3 hours as I would have expected, but I really don't have time to wait any longer, so I'm just gonna start the bread making process. I'm going to make a 50% whole wheat, 50% white bread loaf. First step, we'll be putting in 70 grams of starter. I'm ready at going to be a 70% hydration loaf. It's going to be 400 grams of flour overall, so 70% of that is 280. Let me start. Again, I'm gonna stir the starter and the water together, and that way all of the water contains some sort of wild yeast. Time to add our flours. I'm gonna add 200 grams of white flour, 200 grams of wheat.
And the reason I'm doing a half so I'm gonna mix this, and then I'm gonna set it aside for an hour.
There's no more dry pieces of flour. I am putting a little cover on it, and I'm just gonna let it rest for an hour for what is called the autolyse period. Autolyse is this period of rest. You add the flour and the water to the starter, and you just let it sit from anywhere between 20 minutes and 3 hours. So what that rest period is going to do, it's going to allow the flour to fully hydrate and for it to start forming gluten. Now this will make the dough much smoother and easier to knead and stretch and fold later on. Now it's gone through the autolyse period for an hour, and my dough is a bit easier to deal with. So what I'm gonna do at this point is add the salt. So the reason we're waiting this long to add the salt is because the point of the autolyse period was to allow the dough to be more loose and easier to stretch, whereas the salt is going to inhibit that from happening and just tighten things up, making it harder. Another thing is with this bread, I wanted to experiment and make a Parmesan garlic loaf. So I'm just gonna add 8 grams of Parmesan just because I ran out. If I had more Parmesan, I would add more Parmesan. And then I have 19 grams of garlic because I love garlic. Just mince that up. Now I'm gonna mix everything together. Now that everything's mixed in, I'm gonna do something called the stretch and fold. So with sourdough, we actually don't need to knead it. So I'm gonna just pull it, fold it over, turn it 1/4, pull it, and I don't want the dough to break. Fold it over. It's very sticky and very wet right now, but as we do more rounds of stretch and folds, we're gonna see the dough change. So this is our 3rd stretch, and now we're just gonna do 1 more, so it's on all 4 corners. Now, we're just gonna leave the dough for 30 minutes. And it's time for stretch and fold round 2. Time to wait another 30 minutes. The 3rd round of stretch and fold. All right, the last of the stretch and folds. And now that I finished my final round of stretch and fold, I'm just gonna let this baby wait covered to proof for 2 additional hours. Well, 4 hours have actually passed, not 2. I wanted to go to dinner with my friends, and I knew that if I proofed it longer, it would allow the dough to have a deeper, more complex flavor, which is a win for me. As you can see in here, the dough has pretty much doubled in size. It's definitely gotten a lot bigger, so I'm just gonna flip it out onto the table now. Here, I'm using a rice flour because rice flour is so easy to grab in Vietnam, and because rice flour is a lot less sticky actually than wheat flour. So just laying it on my surface, grabbing my bowl. Since that was such a traumatic incident for the dough, we're gonna let it rest here for 30 minutes and then we're gonna come back and shape everything. So 30 minutes have passed. Expand it a little more. Here we got the dough, lump of dough, and we have a banneton basket for proofing. This is just a line worker basket. I got it on the internet. I'm just gonna rub some rice flour in here. I'm gonna grab this dough, a little more flour to the bottom. Ooh, that was a lot of flour. And then I'm gonna stretch my dough out a bit to where it's about twice the length of the basket. And then, ooh, I don't want it to break. It's very bad. Now I'm gonna just fold it together like an envelope. Oh God, my dough is still really sticky. I'm a bit worried about how this is gonna turn out. I'm just gonna pull it this way now. You want it as taut as possible because you want it to form a kind of skin on the outside. Shape it a little more. I'm gonna drop it into my basket, seam side still up, and just to make it as taut as possible. I'm gonna try to just pull this in. I have my little baby in its basket. I will just now put it in a bag I'm just gonna stick it in my fridge and let it rest overnight, and that way it can ferment more and develop more of that sour flavor that I'm looking for. It's now day 2 of the baking process, and we are finally ready to bake the loaf. I've now got my oven preheated to 200 degrees Celsius or 392 degrees Fahrenheit. You're gonna get this oven really hot. I've included my baking tray in there as well because I also want that to get really hot. Let's just take a look at our dough and see where we're at. It has definitely expanded in size from what we've seen yesterday. You can see it's now reached both sides, and it's also risen up a bit as well. And from smelling it, I can tell the smell has changed. But let's do a little poke test to see if it's ready to bake. Let me just poke the side of this loaf and see what happens. I'm poking it, and I see the hole is just slowly starting to fill in, but it's not springing back right away, and a small indent still remains. This means that our loaf is fully proof. If it springs back too fast, that means it's underproof and we need to wait longer. And if it just sinks or collapses without trying to fill back up, it means that the loaf may be overproofed. But at this point, you may be wondering what I mean by baking an underproof loaf or an overproof loaf. An underproof loaf is going to explode in weird ways in the bread. There's gonna be just so much activity and air within it and nowhere to go. So it's gonna burst out the seams of the bread. And no matter how long you cook it, the inside of an underproof loaf will also be raw, so you're gonna feel quite sick when eating it. With an overproof loaf, this means that the yeast has worked too much and now they're too exhausted. So once you put it in the oven, there's gonna be no more energy or activity left in the yeast. So you're not gonna get an oven spring. The loaf is just going to collapse a bit and not rise. So I'm taking my hot pan out of the oven and I'm working really fast at this point. I'm laying down parchment paper for the loaf to go on, and then I'm gonna flip my loaf onto the parchment paper. I'm gonna put this bowl of water because I don't have a Dutch oven and I need steam to occur within the oven in order for the bread outside to stay moist and not form a crust too early, because I want it to be able to rise before that crust is formed. Now I'm gonna make some slashes really quickly. That way, when the bread starts rising, there's a place for it to expand. Now that I've slashed it, I'm also gonna spray the top of it. Same idea here. I don't want the crust to form too early. And now grab this and stick it into the oven for 30 minutes on the bottom middle rack. All right, 30 minutes has passed, so I'm gonna remove the bowl of water because I no longer need it to steam, and I want it to now develop a nice caramel crust. And then let me flip it around. The oven to 230 degrees Celsius. Flip the pan and drop it in. Tempting as it is, you're actually not supposed to cut into hot bread right out of the oven. We're supposed to let it cool down, process which could take anywhere between half an hour, 2 hours. If we cut it too soon, just like not letting a steak rest, we're not gonna get a great result. Now that the loaf has had time to cool, let me start cutting it. It's just a very tight crumb. There wasn't enough rise. This is the most important part. Let's see how it tastes. Great crumb, moist on the inside. This bread is very delicious tasting, and having chunks of garlic in it is amazing. I think what happened is that with all of this slashing, the bread just ended up a lot flatter than I would have liked. Unfortunate, but at least it tastes good.